societies understand the risks onto that and get a number of complexities around. So firstly, the models that we need to use to understand and model the risks from the climate, from the weather, need to change because they need to take into account how models out there, many different ways to interpret them. They produce a huge amount of data. And so the first challenge is really helping clients, corporates, understand how to interpret the data from these many different models and understand where it's relevant and where it's not. And then the second challenge is that when talking about resilience, so actually building physical very local level, when we're talking about physical risks such as flooding or hurricane. And it really matters whether you're at the top of the hill or at the bottom of the hill as to whether you're going to be impacted and exactly how your asset or is built, designed to know how to build resilience and be better prepared for these things. So these are the kinds of things we help clients understand.
I think we think now on infrastructure more about infrastructure. Strategically, being the head of strategy for this. Why infrastructure now? I think it's becoming new, but why in a specific infrastructure now?
Thank you. I thought I'd actually start with a definition. So infrastructure is the framework of interdependent networks and systems that comprise the distribution capabilities that provide a reliable flow of products and services essential to the economic security and the functioning of government. So we know that infrastructure is really important, but why are we focusing on it now? And I think when Nick was talking about the very local nature of physical risk, he was talking about the house at the top of the hill or the house at the bottom of the hill, and you need to know so you can think about the defenses. But actually, our systems don't act in isolation. Having a house at the top of the hill that is completely cut off from resources, that doesn't have access to basic supplies, is also impacted. And so as we think about supporting, whether it's companies or governments, those infrastructure nodes are critical. So I don't think it's any longer we can just think about damage to specific assets. We need to think about the potential impact on climate change on, I'm now speaking from a business perspective, but on a company's assets, on their supply chain, and on the infrastructure that connects them. I thought I'd also share a couple of data points about just how significant those impacts can be. We know that we need infrastructure following a disaster. The tragic floods in Pakistan that are still affecting Pakistan now, we cannot get aid to communities without functioning infrastructure. Or if we go to the Mississippi River, I don't know how many of you are aware of the significant drought in the Mississippi Basin, but to give you some numbers, the Mississippi River transports more grain more grain passes through the Mississippi River than any other river in the US. It's 70 million tons versus 10 million through the Puget Sound and 28.5 million through the Columbia River. The river's currently flowing at about 7 meters below the normal levels for this time of year. And it means that the cost of shipping grain is up 400%. And that's 400% on this time last year at $80 a ton. And it has been in October over $100 a ton. So the consequences of that lack of infrastructure are really direct on the farming communities that the Mississippi River serves. It means farmers can't lift their crops. It means those that can't transport them. Many of them don't have storage because they're on the banks of the Mississippi River, so they transport their grain. So prices for crops in the US are falling because the normal export isn't happening. And on top of that, the cost of getting grain into the farms is going through the roof because no barges can get up the river. So there are impacts for next year's crop. There are then carbon impacts. So the impact, so a single barge is equivalent to about 16 rail cargoes or 70 trucks. So if we're going to displace a single barge, we suddenly have a much higher carbon load moving that cargo as well as cost. So the metrics I've been using have been around grain, but the Mississippi River also transports feed, coke, sand, gravel, oil, fertilizer, salt, and alcohol. So why is alcohol important? Some people in the audience are saying, yeah, I know. So I was speaking with an airline, a US airline last week, and it's at this time of year that they start to build their supplies of glycol, alcohol for de-icing their plane. And they're struggling to source enough glycol to keep their airports running through winter because the Mississippi River is running so low. So hopefully that's a fairly compelling reason as to why we need to think about our infrastructure. And it's not just the US. I think that's a very tangible example that is happening right now. But the Paranara River in Argentina is the lowest level in 77 years. The Rhine and the Danube in Europe, following our heat waves, have been very, very low. They've only been about 80 centimeters below their normal levels. And I talked about the Mississippi River being meters. And 80 centimeters, the barges and the vessels that go down, many of them can still only transport half the volume of cargo that they would usually transport because the river's too shallow. And I think it's impossible not to also reflect on the impact on hydro, as hydro is a form of infrastructure. So in Southwest United States, going back there, the drought in the Southwest United States is the worst in over 1,200 years. It's an extreme event, and it means that there's now threats to the power supply, critical infrastructure, as well as the infrastructure of the river that the river supports. So absolutely critical to communities on normal times, communities following disasters, and for business to supply the commodities that we all rely on.
Thank you, Amy. I think the negative consequences becomes much bigger than before because of the climate risk. So, Scott, if I can, since you are mainly specific to Africa and Middle East, if I can ask the same question, Amy told us about Mississippi, about Argentina, Pakistan. Do we have the same thing in our region, whether Africa or Middle East?
Thanks, Haitham. And yes, we do. And I think going back to your original question, why is infrastructure getting so much attention and so vital these days? It's because we're seeing the physical impacts of climate change on infrastructure. Now, an example in our region from the other end of the African continent is maybe what we've seen in South Africa in the last few years. If you look at the city of Cape Town in the last 3 years or so, it's been perilously close to day zero in terms of water, in terms of drought. And the infrastructure in terms of water containing dams, we see getting to zero, and that has implications apart from just running out of water as well. But more recently, in the area around Durban, the east coast of South Africa, we had significant and rapid flooding in April of this year. And that had a couple of key infrastructure and kind of climate change impacts. The first being that Toyota has a large production plant in Durban that had just started to roll out hybrid vehicles, the first of the many plants in South Africa to do so, and some of the first hybrid vehicles built in Africa. Their entire plant was significantly flooded, and it really prevented any meaningful production between the months of April and September. So almost half the year in terms of production capacity, getting vehicles that are not just pure internal combustion engines on the road, it was stopped. I think another impact that it's had, the flooding really showed the crumbling nature of some of the infrastructure in that region as well, especially the sewerage system, which just could not cope with the volume of water and was permanently damaged. That resulted in sewage leaks in numerous areas across the city, but more importantly into the sea and around the beaches in that area, which caused a lot of closures of beaches and sea-based activities around the coast. Now, we're heading into December soon in South Africa. That is the main tourism season. And if those beaches are closed and cannot operate, or if there is sewage in the water that discourages people from visiting the area for their holidays, that is a hugely detrimental economic impact on that area. So some really severe examples of the impact on infrastructure of climate change and the consequences thereof there, yeah.
Thank you, Scott. So we will not leave Africa for now. Nick, let's go to Egypt. A lot of talks nowadays about Egypt's susceptibility towards the climate change. What can we expect? We know that it's not only the Suez Canal being one of the leading waterway for trade and all of this, but we can talk, we know about Alexandria, for example, a lot of talks about these things because Egypt against susceptibility about climate change is a question mark now. I know that you have a big study about Suez Canal, so I will not ask now, but can we have a small presentation from you? Then we can ask later about how can we solve this thing. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Tham. So as Haitham described there, we've heard about broader infrastructure and some of the threats that we're seeing through climate change. We're going to bring it into focus on Africa and specifically the Suez Canal. So if we'd have the next slide, please. And one more. Perfect. So just to set a little bit of context here. So if we talk about global supply chains, these have been massively stressed over the last 2 years. And it's worth knowing that 80 to 90% of goods are traded by sea. And during the global lockdowns, shipping capacity was massively reduced. Which were, when reversed, when the lockdowns were reversed, a huge amount of pent-up demand took place, overwhelming supply chains, which coincided, incidentally, with a massive increase in e-commerce. So 30% of global GDP in 2019, and it grew through the pandemic largely to 2021. So, and that meant that goods to consumers were delayed, and the cost of shipping those goods was increased. So that's the backdrop that we see. If we could go to the next slide, please. So, and in fact, if we talk about goods transported by sea, in fact, there are only a handful of key waterways critical to these supply chains. There's the Panama Canal in the Americas, the Suez Canal, Bab el-Mandeb in the Middle East, as well as the Straits of Hormuz, and then the Straits of Malacca over in Asia. And you can see 80–90% of goods transported, most of it filters at some point through one of these five critical waterways. If we go to the next slide, please. So let's talk now about the Suez Canal and its importance to global shipping and Egypt. So it's the quickest sea route between Asia and Europe. 10 to 12% of global trade actually goes through the Suez Canal, and 30% of cargo containers. It contributes 2 to 3% of Egypt's GDP, so it's a huge contribution, and incidentally provides a major source of the government's foreign currency. And as such, the government has invested a huge amount in it. So significant investment has been made to upgrade the port infrastructure, widen, deepen the canal to ensure its operation. You can tell how critical it is. If we move to the next slide. Haitham mentioned it earlier, the Ever Given event that took place back in May 2021. This is the Ever Given ship that got wedged in the canal and ran aground in high winds. So there were winds of over 74 kilometers per hour, and a heavily laden ship such as the Ever Given in fact acts as a sail in these kinds of winds, and it was pushed across the canal and blocked the canal. It cost $10 billion per day in disrupted trade. So with the 6 days that it was blocked, $60 billion of disrupted trade. So a huge consequence to not only to Egypt, but also to global supply chains. If we move to the next slide. So let's talk now a little bit about climate change and how this impacts. Firstly, Haitham again mentioned it, Egypt is already susceptible to climate change on the ND Gain Country Index, which is a measure of a country's vulnerability to climate and its ability to implement resilience. Egypt is ranked 107 of 181 countries, so it's the bottom half, and that's because it's already susceptible to coastal flooding impacts. So the Nile Delta particularly vulnerable to rising sea levels because of the low-lying land. This gives rise to saltwater intrusion, which can impact food production yields. Also, more heat waves. Most parts of the country are now 1 degree hotter than they were before climate change really took hold, and indeed reduced precipitation. So annual total precipitation reduced by 20% over the last 30 years. So we're already talking about a country which has seen some of the effects of climate change. So let's talk about, we go to the next slide, let's talk about specifically the Suez Canal. So we wanted to understand what are the risks associated with the Suez Canal specifically. And for this, we worked with one of our model providers, a leading physical risk model provider called the Cross Dependency Initiative, or XDI, to undertake this analysis. And we looked at firstly 4 of the key infrastructure sites associated with the Suez Canal. So there's up in the north, Port Said, Port Fuad, and the Suez Canal Container Park, and then in the south, on the Red Sea end, Port Taufik as well. And as well as looking at those specific infrastructure sites, we looked at the risks associated with the length of the canal itself. And what we did was assess what are the physical risks that we see today and how are those going to change over the course of the century. And we took we took a 2050 and a 2100 snapshot, as well as the snapshot of today. And if we move to the next slide, we can see what some of those effects were. So for the port infrastructure specifically, so firstly, physical risk increased over the course of this century, and perhaps not surprisingly, the major driver of this was coastal inundation driven by sea level rise. So if you look at the charts on the graphics on the right-hand side, you have both the south and the north, the southern and the northern parts, 2020 through to 2100, and the darker the green color, the higher the risk. So you can see that as you go down the page, you can see that green getting darker. And as I say, mostly driven by coastal inundation. And in fact, the biggest impact is actually at the northern port infrastructure, actually around the Suez Canal container park. And so so some of the challenges this gives rise to, sorry, if we could just go back to the previous slide a moment, some of the challenges this gives rise to: the integrity of infrastructure and port operations, due to disruption to the loading, unloading, movement of cargo, and also the whole communication networks that the canal relies on that are housed in these infrastructure sites can be put at risk. And then if we look at the canal itself, and we can go to the next slide, please. So now we're looking at the canal waterway. Here we looked at specifically two risks: the risk of extreme heat and extreme wind. And what we found was, firstly, the extreme heat events reaching 45 degrees centigrade or more, double by 2050 versus today, and increase by 7-fold by 2100. And secondly, extreme wind, some marginal increase over the course of this century, so the same and worse. And this means that, so this affects soil moisture, and when you combine the two, sandstorm events are more likely. That results in greater sand deposition in the canal, which can increase the risk of things like the Ever Given event happening, because it makes the canal depth, it reduces canal depth. And it's worth noting, extreme heat can also cause other knock-on impacts, productivity loss, as workers are unable to work in the kind of heat, the kind of extreme heat that we're talking about here, as well as some of the less obvious things. In fact, increased temperatures mean increased temperature of the water, so ships cannot cool their engines effectively, so maybe they have to travel more slowly. And changes in ocean salinity mean that the buoyancy of ships is altered, and perhaps more of the ship is exposed to these kind of wind events in a higher salinity ocean. So a number of knock-on impacts to consider. So if we go to the next page. So the clear question is, well, what does this mean in terms of building resilience? And we have identified three areas for, in this case, the Suez Canal, but infrastructure more broadly to consider. Firstly, what are the physical resilience measures that can be put in place to protect assets? Secondly, what are the financial enablers that can de-risk the investment necessary to put these physical resilience measures in place? And finally, an underpinning resilience strategy to make sure that everything makes sense as a whole. So if we go to the next slide, we can just talk about each one of those briefly. Firstly, physical resilience, what do we mean? So in the case of the Suez Canal, for example, we talked about the risk of coastal inundation, so addition of flood barriers, raising critical equipment out of harm's way to ensure that assets have a long-term viability, lifespan. And also potentially larger scale considerations, so maybe locks would need to be considered, as well as sort of raising and hardening of banks to make sure that physical resilience is in place. If we talk next about the financial enablers, so these are large infrastructure investments, and in order to facilitate those, you need access to stable long-term capital. So that means that might take the form of government sponsorship. We've heard a lot at this COP about blended finance. I think this is a great example of where it might be appropriate. Direct-to-market bonds issues or lending by institutional investors could be considered. But also, insurance has a critical role to play. So mechanisms such as insurance-backed or reinsurance-backed schemes to enable the development of resilience measures to de-risk the investment required. And traditional insurance to act as a buffer to cover the associated losses as these long-term, decadal investments take to build can also play a role. And finally, resilience strategies. So all of this needs to be underpinned by a consistent, structured approach. I reference here the UN Principles for Resilient Infrastructure as a reference for these kinds of measures. Things like, for example, considering the adaptation window. So when are the kind of risks that you're protecting against likely to kick in? That should feed into the investment life cycle and be considered in terms of the broader investment and capital expenditure of the organization that oversees the asset, but also reviewing operating procedures. So we've already heard about the productivity loss of extreme heat. There are people, human consequences of these kinds of impacts that need to be considered. And so a holistic approach is really necessary to make sure that the organization is fully resilient to these kinds of risks. So finally, let me just leave you with those three areas of focus. So firstly, building resilience means physical resilience to protect assets. It means the financial enablers to de-risk the investment required. And finally, it means the resilience holistic strategy to underpin the approach. And just to let you know, there is a full report here around the work we did looking at the Suez Canal, as well as more information around the kind of measures that can be taken. And it's available following this QR code if you're interested. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. I think it's... Thank you for the very nice presentation, crisp, to the point, and what I like very much is the three takeaways, which is very simple: physical resilience, financial enablers. Let's understand well. I didn't realize that the daily run rate of the ever given problem was $10 billion. So yes, very high negative consequences, as you highlighted about the infrastructure. So thank you again. Scott, if I can, if I have a firm now, if I have an infrastructure, whatever project, how can we identify the resilience opportunities, if I can put it like this, to the operations and the strategy as a whole? Yani if I have an operation now as a firm or as a company, how can I identify where are the resilience opportunities?
Thank you, Haitham. I think the key thing in order to identify the opportunities is first to fully understand where your vulnerabilities are. And a key thing for a company when they're considering those vulnerabilities, obviously it will include your own physical assets, but it needs to go wider than that in terms of what a company would consider in terms of surrounding infrastructure. So what might be the impact on your business of a natural catastrophe on the road network or public transport network or freight rail network that you might depend on for the activities of your business? Even as far as, are you in a fairly remote location and the majority of your workers live in a concentrated area close by, that if that was to be impacted, it would have a significant impact on your workforce from a business continuity perspective. Service companies are also not immune to this. Think about the need for data centers. Data centers need to be kept cool, they need to be kept dry. What would be the, where is your data center located if it's not close to your actual premises? And what is the climate risk in that area as well, similar to, Nick discussed for the Suez Canal. Understanding that full picture then enables you to say, what are our key vulnerabilities, the ones that we need to address first, and focus on those. And it can be through the type of solutions that Nick mentioned in your three key takeaways for the Suez Canal. It would be the same thing of physical resilience. What would we need to do maybe from an engineering perspective to mitigate potential risk? Under what kind of strategy? And financially, how do we go about enabling that? So that's how companies need to start to tackle the journey of understanding where our risk is and the opportunities to address it.
And maybe if I could just add one comment to that. So, as Scott said, identifying the opportunity, identifying the vulnerabilities is key. And in fact, one thing that's quite powerful is to really understand which are the vulnerabilities that you want to mitigate the risk to, and which are those that you have to adapt to. So it's just the mitigation and adaptation as well. There are, and we think of it in terms of resistance. So what risks are you going to resist? Maybe if it's a flood risk you're trying to resist, maybe it's building a flood wall, versus those that you're wanting to be able to recover from quickly. So, for example, you may accept that your facility is going to be flooded, so make sure that it's such that you can wash it down and you're good to go the following day, and it doesn't disrupt operations. So there are different ways to think of resilience, and they don't necessarily mean removing the risk altogether.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Nick. I mean, if I'm a stakeholder now, I'm a stakeholder, I have an existing infrastructure, I'm not building something for new. What are the key considerations that I have to take care of while I'm building such a resilience?
I think it's a great question. And actually, a lot of what we're talking about, these are things that aren't inside a company's or an individual's control. A lot of the infrastructure is owned by communities or by governments. And so that makes it a much more challenging question. If we just go back to buildings for a second and we think about the scale of the issue, we know that 80% of the buildings that we'll have in 2050 already exist. So this isn't just about how we think about building new. We've also got an extensive need to retrofit and to adapt and to make sure that those assets are still viable, that we don't have stranded assets. I don't have a similar data point for infrastructure, but I did think it was interesting thinking about what were the components of infrastructure and will the components of our infrastructure change. So at the moment, when we think about infrastructure, we think about wires, roads, bridges, tunnels, waterways. And a lot of those we'll still need, but I think we also need to anticipate there'll probably be different types of infrastructure. What infrastructure will we need for driverless cars? What infrastructure will we need for satellite-based solar energy generation? So there's a type of infrastructure. We then need to think about identifying the vulnerabilities. And then there are very few organizations, I think, that have the capital at the moment to undertake these resilience measures. So I think it's vital that people understand their exposure now, so that CapEx can be planned, understanding the sort of the adaptation window that Nick referred to in his presentation. So during that adaptation window that we still have, the CapEx can be planned to be as efficient as possible. So if we're making repairs to a road surface, for example, that we're also thinking about not just repairing the road surface, we start to think about the camber of the road to make sure that it's designed to shed water, rather than having one contractor to go in and fit the potholes and then have a climate adaptation strategy that is separate and not integrated, whatever that word is, not integrated. So it's all part of the resilience strategy that Nick talked about. You have to have the information, first of all, to understand the vulnerabilities, so then any CapEx is contemplating the changes that we need to make as we go through adaptation. I mean, Nick talked about sort of some of the physical prevention barriers, and we do a lot of work thinking about what they may be for all of the different climate adaptations, whether it's freeze-thaw, wildfire, fire, flood. And so there are some things that can be done, but people also need to get better at recovery and thinking about how we do that as quickly as possible, and that should all be in the CapEx plan.
That's great. Thank you, Amy. The second point, which is financial enabler. Yani if we talk, I think we spoke about the physical resilience. About the second point, which is the financial enabler. Nick highlighted as well that insurance or insurers, they do have some mechanisms to help on this. Can you shed more light about how can we do this in practice?
And I should start by saying I don't think it's easy. So although insurance has tools, and I think they're a key part, I don't think it's easy. So I remember my very first week in insurance going on an introduction to insurance course, and the person at the front of the room saying that insurance underpins and is the lubricant of our financial system. Aeroplanes don't fly, hospitals don't get built, industry doesn't happen without insurance, that most certainly companies need to have the volatility protection to make capital investments. And increasingly we're finding that governments who maybe haven't used insurance in the past do not have the financial ability to withstand some of these economic shocks. So we need to think about insurance as providing some of that mitigation capital that does so well. But I think a data point that it's worth flagging is that the global penetration of the insurance industry is 7%. There are so many communities and people that don't have access to insurance currently that we need to also think about increasing the access to people. Now, that doesn't answer your question about insurance and infrastructure, but I think it's worth flagging that there are a lot of people that are exposed. So insurance can provide capital post-event, but when things are no longer risks, they become certainty, then insurance isn't an option. If you know you're going to flood, then the cost of $100 million of limits, and I can see the insurer in the room is nodding, that when it's no longer a risk, but it's a certainty, then that doesn't work. But that doesn't mean we don't have tools. So the risk analysis, the risk quantification that the insurance has built up, the knowledge that we've built up over many decades, we understand mitigation measures, we understand prioritization, and I think those tools really come into play. And I'm delighted to be joined by a colleague of mine, Francis Bouchard from Marsh McLennan, who's been one of the authors of a report that we published on Thursday. It's a really long week here, so no one really knows. We published on Thursday with the UN about Race to Resilience, which showcases 17 projects where the insurance industry is supporting climate change adaptation. Now, they're not all infrastructure projects, but there are certainly infrastructure projects in there where insurance is being used to help municipalities either prepare for events or to be able to respond. So I think there's a lot that we can do. I think one of the other areas that insurance can help is thinking about how claims proceeds are spent. So the insurance premiums globally are currently just over $5 trillion. And if we think about insurers' expense ratios, if we call it 30%, and they're not even making a 10% profit at the moment, so let's say it's kind of $3.5 billion in claims are being paid to claimants every year. Now, I could be out by quite a few billion, and it's still a really big number. And so if we think about that amount of money, that amount of investment that the insurance industry is funding in rebuilds, I think the insurance industry has a really important ability to influence how the proceeds are being spent to make sure that we are contemplating adaptation and mitigation. So there are a number of ways. None of them are a silver bullet.
Thank you, Amy. I think if we continue under this point in specific, we can stay for hours and hours, because 7% insurance penetration. So I think, yeah, in Egypt, we need a lot of insurance awareness. But the bright side of it, it's an untapped opportunity, or there is a potential for this. Yet, I think that's great. A lot of things. Insurance, of course, with such billions and trillions in some cases of investments. So we can help a lot. Scott, I'm usually asking Amy and Nick about the global, and for you, I'm zooming into Africa. How can African insurance market adapt or see the climate change adaptation? Can you give us some highlights about how the African insurance market's adaptation to the climate change?
So, Haitham, I think the first key thing is, if we look at Africa as a continent, we could bear the brunt of some of the most significant impacts of climate change. So, as a continent, we have to be innovative, and there has to be collaboration right through all different levels and aspects of the insurance industry to address some of the impacts of climate change. You know, Amy mentioned the penetration of insurance at 7%. I think it's fair to say that in a number of African countries, and probably taking out Egypt here in South Africa where I reside, there really is a lack of significant established formal insurance industry. Now, that can create issues, but it also means that in those markets, the traditional insurance mindset can almost be bypassed by that innovative and collaborative approach to focus on products that are really specific to the needs of those markets as they arise. Some of the areas where I think we will see in Africa becoming more prevalent from an insurance perspective is around parametric-based type of cover. So looking at, thresholds of certain natural catastrophes or weather type of events rather than individuals having specific claims related to their situation. It may free up the payment of claims more quickly and enable the rebuild that may be required or other types of adaptation going forward to be done more quickly. I do see that happening. And I think the ask from African insurers collectively would be to have that open mindset of innovation and collaboration to free up the capital to get the capacity there to meet the needs that are coming for the continent.
And if I can add, there was an announcement, again, I'm not going to guess the day, but one day this week, from 85 African insurers have created a $14 billion fund for insurance climate resilience in Africa. They hope to be able to impact 1.4 billion citizens through this fund. I don't know the detail of it. I know they're looking to raise a 900 million from the global market. 900 million from the global market. But we know that there's an ambition to have a lot more self-sufficiency on the African continent and to create local solutions that solve some of the local problems.
I think this is a very good news, and I'm so proud that such things, I think, will be such decisions will be taken during the COP27. So really, it helps. 14 billion. I didn't know this. Thank you for the 14 billion from 85 insurers. That's perfect. Thank you, Scott. So you have now 14 billion from Emmy and the 85 insurers. Okay. You can increase the penetration, and you can work on many things. Okay. Back to Nick after the nice presentation. So you can now talk more with us. What about, you highlighted the third bullet point or the third action, which is the strategy. We must have a strategy. It's not case by case or something like this. So if we can have a high level overview, how might a firm develop a strategy, a broader resilience strategy for a firm or for an organization?
So it's really around thinking about resilience in every part of the firm's operations and also their strategic direction, which means their financial investments that they need to make. So I gave a few examples as part of the presentation. So for example, things like business continuity plans. Are you thinking about how climate change is going to impact, how those are going to change under a changing climate, for example? Are you thinking about how, Amy talked about the capital expenditure and the investment cycle that firms go through? Are you thinking about resilience as part of those, for example? And are you thinking about the timing of the investments to make sure that you're building resilience when it matters most? So it's a really ensuring that you're thinking of resilience at every step of the process, I think, is the most important.
If I may add to that, we're also talking, when we're talking about infrastructure, we're talking about, certainly from a corporate point of view, it's an unowned asset. And so it's not as if you can make a physical, you can't go out and fix the roads yourself. So understanding where your vulnerabilities are, so you can have multiple supply routes, so having alternatives, but then also influencing governments, influencing stakeholders. So then prioritizing, making sure that you're advocating for the infrastructure you're reliant on. And we see that a lot in the US, where companies that are hurricane affected may no longer want to rely on the national power grid, where they may be, I don't know, 10 miles of pylons that could come down in a windstorm event. They would much rather be self-sufficient for power, which actually is a virtuous circle because it incentivizes local production, local energy production, normally renewables. And so some of the resilience measures that you may do to remove your dependency on an unowned asset may actually have a virtuous impact on the climate as well.
Thank you. The presentation as well, or in the presentation, Nick highlighted that there is UN developing principles for disaster resilient infrastructure. Why are broader frameworks and programs beyond individual assets? Can you explore more about this? How, of course, the strategy will underpin what we are doing, yet such UN developing principles, how can help?
Well, I think it's really important because it's a very different perspective than the corporate perspective, and a lot of what Nick and Scott have been talking about have been from a corporation's perspective rather than the government. And government has very different metrics than profit and loss and business interruption. Governments need to think about the communities that they serve, and so the Sendai framework, which was developed following the meeting in 2015 on the east coast of Japan, developed 7 principles. 4 things that governments should look to reduce as they build their resilience, and 3 things they should look to increase. So governments need to be focused on reducing mortality, reducing the number of people who are impacted by events, reducing the impact on GDP, and reducing the damage to infrastructure. So very different metrics than you'd see in a corporate setting. The Sendai framework also says that countries need to increase the number of the quality of the resilience strategies. They need to increase cooperation, and we need to increase the availability of multi-hazard warning systems. So I think having these frameworks are very helpful, that we've got an organization like the UN talking at a country level about the very different metrics and the different priorities than the profit and loss business interruption, which in reality we spend most of our day thinking about.
I think, yeah, it will give more structured way of understanding. Yani, from the presentation, we cannot say what is the quantification of what is needed, for example, for the Suez Canal. Yet with having such programs, we can identify with the government at a later stage, how can we put milestones, how can we put plan, where to go, all of this. So I think, yes, the 7 or, I don't know, 7 or 8, 7 maybe, this will put us in a very structured way how to move forward. So Nick, the future climate change, it's very dynamic. It becomes very, very, very dynamic. How might future climate pathways alter the need for adaptation?
So it is true that under various climate scenarios, we are likely to see varying levels of physical risk and therefore physical impacts due to climate change. But in fact, there is no question that under all scenarios, we will see some kind of physical impact. So for example, if you take flooding, is expected to increase under every single climate modeling scenario that we have. So I think I guess my short answer to your question is it doesn't matter. All organizations, societies, companies need to think about resilience regardless of which particular pathway we are on.
Thank you. I know that I asked many, many questions, but if I can finish with one statement from each of the gurus we have today as a takeaway for the audience, for everybody to take with them. What can we say as a thought about physical resilience and climate risk? And ladies first.
I think I would say that it's critical to start. So model your exposures, understand where they are so you can start to build a strategy.
And I guess take action now based on my previous comment. This is coming regardless of whichever climate pathway we follow, and don't wait to build resilience. The time is now.
And I think, just to round off, as I've been from the African perspective, I would say don't wait for the rest of the world to do it for us. Be involved in the process and the change that we're seeing, and in particular the insurance industry. Be part of the innovation, be part of the collaboration to create, as Amy said, the African solutions for the African problems.
Thank you. The audience, any questions? For me, I learned a lot. I'm a life insurance guy and medical insurance guy, but I learned a lot today. Thank you so much for March team. Really appreciated all of the things. Any question from the audience? Please.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. I'm Franziska Arnold-Weyer from Queen Mary University of London. And I have a question on the financial enabling aspect. You mentioned insurance and reinsurance, and Amy elaborated on using claims proceeds to build back better. What possibilities are there for insurers to financially support sort of pre-loss risk mitigation? So, for example, by way of, I don't know, premium rebates or something like a no claims bonus, which then can be sort of reinvested into adaptation and mitigation. What's the thinking there? Thank you.
So for the non-insurance people, it's not unusual for a policy to have a no claims or a low claims bonus to reward companies who have managed their risk well, and that's normally earned at the end of the policy. Sometimes it's earned at the front of the policy and repayable if you don't meet certain loss metrics. I think the insurance industry is very motivated and has a really strong desire to find ways to help. One of the challenges, the annual insurance cycle, that an insurer that makes investments in resilience in 1 year, there's no reason that that insurer will be the beneficiary of future premiums. And that annual cycle is one of the biggest challenges and one of the biggest barriers to the suggestion that you make. Now, insurers themselves struggle to break that annual cycle because they rely on reinsurance. And so even if we could say, well, let's strike a long-term relationship for the insurance carriers whose capital is dependent on reinsurers, they may not be able to make longer commitments. So I think there's a huge amount in that needs to be unpicked to increase the term of the relationship so people have aligned not incentives, but have aligned motives. Yeah. And there are some of the insurers that have the capital base, and I think we'll see some of those continental insurers that I think will move towards that. But otherwise, I think it's that annual term that's the really big barrier to making significant progress.
Scott.
Maybe just to add, Marsh as insurance brokers, the relationship between the client, Marsh, and the insurer themselves. We have the slip fee concept, and sometimes these go towards very specific risk assessment type criteria. I think as the nature of risk changes and climate change becomes a bigger part of that risk, more of that can be redirected to the strategic aspect as well, I would say, in terms of climate change to assist clients in that regard.
Done? Any other question? Ale.
Yeah, many thanks for the presentation. I think we've learned a lot today, as Hassan said. As far as Marsh is concerned, I mean, you've done this study and maybe you're doing a lot of studies, but let's focus on Egypt. Do you have like application or anything else that you have issued recently or you're going to issue in such scenarios, not only Suez Canal, but other areas? Because we've been reading about the Delta and the Nile and some other scary stuff that we're hearing left and right. And I don't know if you have something to share with us in the market.
Thank you. I think the point you make is fundamentally about data. And one of the things I've found very exciting here is the number of open access data platforms that organizations, the UN, DRR, Oxford University are publishing. So then more people and more communities have access to the likely impacts of climate change under various scenarios. We do have other publications that are coming out, both as Marsh, and we're part of Marsh McLennan through Guy Carpenter. And so I feel shameless plugging them, but they're all available on our website, and we'll certainly make sure we share them with you. So we are looking at specific areas geographically, but I think most excitingly is the fact that more and more data will become open source, so everyone can access it.
I'm not sure this question is politically right or not, but what is the next step? Yani if I can say, okay, we have now the Suez Canal. Allah is talking about many other things that can happen over the next century or whatever. What is the next step that we as a federation in Egypt can say, yes, this is the next step? Do we have any framework or anything that we can do?
I think there was a really important number in Nick's presentation, which is either 3 or 4% of Egyptian GDP. So there's a huge amount of motivation to keep the Suez, to think about the protection of the Suez Canal. And so from that, I think it's dialogue with the various stakeholders to say, how do we think about resilience? Not to suggest that there needs to be the funds to create the physical resilience in 2023, but to at least have the foundations of a plan so that can be built into the management over the next 10 years. So there's a really strong incentive here to get the stakeholders together to make sure that that the waterway keeps working.
And I just add to that know that there are these frameworks out there. We talked about the UNDRR that you can lean on. So you're not trying to invent something new. There are existing frameworks. So as Amy said, I think use those, leverage those, and engage with your stakeholders so that can start to be built into business as usual.
And I think you highlighted as well that we started already deepening and widening already. I mean, we started, but maybe we needed more in a more faster way or more structured way with the UNDR. Type. And I'm done. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the discussion and the presentation as well. Truly appreciate. And if we don't have any other questions, we are okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.